Well, hello, Ali. I am so glad to finally connect with you and
Hmm.
talk to you about stuff regarding Homer's Iliad and
Yes.
relates to your work. So, first, tell me about how you think that your work relates to Homer's Iliad.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here, and I've been meaning to connect with you for a while now. I'm a big fan of your work,
Thank you.
engagement with the public, particularly bringing music. I was mentioning that I studied Homer as well when I was in college, took classics classes. We translated from Greek, we translated the Aeneid from Latin, but I never had the auditory experience. Like we never heard Homer. So hearing Homer come to life in that way has been really amazing. And love the work that you do. My engagement with Homer starts kind of in two separate ways. First is the traditional classics approach to it. That is that I studied Homer in school. I think everyone in high school reads the Odyssey at one point, and that really whets your appetite for the classics. And so once I got into college, I did take a lot of classics classes. I specialized in my undergraduate in ancient history in particular, working kind of from a global lens, looking at the Mediterranean more broadly. But so we had a lot of classics classes, ancient Roman classes, and that was one approach. But as I developed into my speciality, which is looking at Islamic cosmology, one of the things I'm particularly interested in is the way in which certain supernatural figures, divinities, powers, natural forces overlap with the Homeric tradition. And we start to see a broad cross cultural Mediterranean, ancient Near East understanding. And we see this in particular with the Jinn. And so I am part of a group of scholars, several of us, who are trying to situate the Jinn within the ancient Near East in late antiquity. And we see it connecting with ancient Syriac sources, some Greco-Roman sources, and there is some Homeric overlap, particularly in the way some of the divinities are portrayed, and in particular, the broader Greek concept of the genius also relates some ways to the jinn. And so one might think Islamic cosmology and history, what does it have anything to do with Homer? There's some connections there.
Okay, so which books in Homer are like which particular passages can you think of that makes you really see the connections?
Yeah, I can't think of passages off the top of my head, but I can tell you that certain divinities in particular have very jinn-like qualities, or I should say that jinn have very similar qualities to the divinities there. Eris, the goddess of discord, is one prime example of this. A lot of the connections that we see with Eris from really kind of starting the Trojan War in many ways because she's been affronted is very similar to the language we see about the jinn. There is a whole discourse about jinn causing discord amongst people's lives. And in fact, there's a tradition that talks about that the jinn scatter seeds in a person's house. And by scattering seeds, that causes enmity between husband and wife and father and son and whatnot. And that is very similar to the idea of Eris and her apple and causing discord. Similarly, with the messenger of the gods, which is quite interesting because in the Iliad, we see the rainbow goddess, and then in the Odyssey, we see Hermes, right? So there's a sort of transition. But both of those figures have a lot of commonalities with the Jinn. Both the rainbow goddess, who is related to this sort of sky connection related to the gods, bringing the messages of the gods. This is in many ways what we believe was the original function of the jinn in Arabian societies and pre-Islamic Arabian societies, in that they functioned as messengers for the gods, as tutelary genius spirits that would connect the individual to the divinities above, the Arabian gods of Alat, Al-Manat, and Hubal, etc. And so there is an oracular component to that, and that's where we see Hermes play a role. Hermes being not only the messenger of the gods, but also the god of merchants and trade and crossroads and alchemy and whatnot. And that mercurial component is very much found in the jinn, who are also related to these liminal spaces like crossroads, to these ideas of carrying messages between the divine realms and the human realms, as well as things like trade and exchanges and even alchemy. And so those two divinities in particular, the messenger of the gods and the discord gods, seem to have a lot of overlap with the jinn. Also, the idea of a genius that we kind of see implicit within Homer, but broadly in Greek culture or Hellenistic mythology more broadly, the idea of some type of divinity that is unique to every individual, a genius that then inspires, moves, and drives. We can talk about this as the sort of Socratic genius, if you will, also very much like the Jinn. The Jinn act as a genius spirit with individual connections, either for oracular means or for inspiration.
That's amazing. I mean, that's not something that the public would sit there and just think there's a connection here.
Right.
Like naturally.
Mhm.
Interdisciplinarians like me, though, are always thinking, mythology
Yeah, yeah.
and troublemaker. So I'm glad you brought
Mhm.
up Discord, Eris. What is the word? Is there a word like Discord, Eris, that's equivalent?
Right. There isn't one that is like one singular person. Jinn causes discord, and so that this is their name and it means discord. It's more a function of Jinn, and sometimes they remain sort of nameless. They exist, but they also take on sort of animal forms, black cats, snakes, dogs. And so these Jinn sort of appear, and by mere presence or by the scattering of seeds, they cause tribulations, they cause conflict, and they cause tensions. Some of them are named. So, for example, there's Wasim, who's named, who's believed to cause some type of discord. There's some of them, for example, Maymoon is known for causing discord, but their names don't necessarily translate to discord. So, for example, Maymoon just means some type of monkey-like creature, is the way that they describe what Maymoon actually means. But it's more a function of what they are. Their mere presence can cause discord, or they intentionally cause discord in a person's life. So they less, and I think this is where we can note a distinction, they're less a personification of discord itself, because they don't see the Jinn as divinities, but rather as messengers of the divine. But instead, they have some sort of connection to discord or connection to messengers, a connection to genius, and that is their function rather than their personification or their embodiment. So that's where I think that we can see a very clear distinction between the Jinn and the gods of Homer.
I want to go back to the idea of Iris, the
Mhm.
rainbow goddess messenger,
Yeah, yeah,
and so the Jinn but they're different sorts of messages that they're bringing,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Are they working for any specific gods or goddesses? In the same way, usually we connect Hermes usually to Zeus, uh,
right,
and we usually connect Iris to Hera. This is not always the case,
right.
but yeah, can you tell me more about the various functions of these messengers and whom they're serving and what's their purpose?
Right. Yeah, the messenger gods in particular seem to have quite a bit of overlap with the Jinn, or the Jinn have a lot of connections both with the rainbow goddess Iris and with Hermes as well. Both of them are quite distinct, but you have similar components in the Jinn. The Jinn don't serve any one particular deity, but generally are representative of many deities. So if a person was trying to gain inspiration or wisdom or advice from a particular god, that god might interact with them through the Jinn. We do see one god in particular that has a lot of connections with the messengers, Hubal, but they're not exclusive to Hubal in the same way that Hermes and Mercury are uniquely associated with Zeus and Jupiter in the Greco-Roman tradition. So there isn't a unique one-on-one relationship, but they are more broadly connected to the messengers of all the gods. And the idea is that if the gods wanted to send an omen, or if the gods wanted to connect with someone, they would then send a Jinn who acts as the intermediary between the two realms. Not quite fully divine, but also not corporeal. They act as a sort of liminal being that exists in both of these realms as a messenger of the hidden realms. The other thing that we see is their connection to the oracular means. Both uh, Hermes and the messenger gods more broadly in the Greek tradition, as well as Apollo, have connections to oracles that providing prophecy and wisdom and guidance. That is another form of message that the gods send humans, right? It's oracles and prophecies. The Jinn are connected in that way as well. In fact, we believe that the primary function of the Jinn in pre Islamic Arabian society was as oracular spirits for the priests known as the Kahin. The Kahin would invoke the Jinn, and through some sort of mediumistic practice, the Jinn would then speak through them in rhyming verses, which is not dissimilar to the Oracle of Delphi or the Sibyl of Cumae or these other sort of oracles that we find in the Mediterranean and ancient Greek civilizations. So the jinn have that component as well. In fact, the Quran, when Islam arrives into Arabia, the Quran actually addresses this and says there may have been a time where the jinn had access to the future, but now they're liars. Don't believe them. Don't listen to the future that they tell you, because the future that they tell you is a lie, or they'll say one truth in the middle of a great deal of lies. And so there is a recognition, and we can read that as historians as a recognition that their pre-Islamic function was that of oracular spirits. And so you see some connections with Apollo and the Oracle of Delphi as well.
I'm gonna have to bug you sometime for that particular passage.
Yeah, sure.
I'm gonna have to ask you for that and cut and paste it and put it there, because that is really that really reminds me of the bee women passage in the Homeric hymn to Hermes, where it says, these bee women that I'm giving you, if you feed them honey, they're going to give you truth, but if you don't, then they get angry and they won't. And then of course we get other things like the muses when they first come down and talk to Hesiod, and they say, we're going to tell you some things that are true and some things that are not true. It's like, okay, so which part of this is true and not true? It's interesting. Of course, at some point I'm going to ask you about cats, right?
I'm all about cats, so happy to talk about cats.
The liminal world, as you say.
Right.
And you're known as, on Twitter anyway, as the Jinn guy with all the pictures. What do cats have to do with Jinn?
Yeah, a lot of animals have some overlap or connection with the jinn in the Islamic tradition, in the Middle Eastern tradition as well. Dogs and snakes. Sometimes we see ostriches and deer, but cats in particular are said to have a unique relationship with the jinn, as either the jinn take on their form or the cats can see jinn. And I think there's a cross-cultural thing around that. We could probably even say global thing about cats having some connection with the supernatural, whether they're able to see the supernatural or they act as familiar spirits for the supernatural, or they embody, for example, certain spirits become cats. So cats, this is a ubiquitous thing in global folklore and global cosmologies, that you find cats really at the heart of all sorts of language, or connections to necromancy, spirits, ghosts, demons, gods, goddesses, transformations. Cats, whatever the culture it is, there's something about cats in it. And so the jinn represent that. There is a fascinating relationship of the jinn with the cat. There's a whole tradition that says that if you come home and you find a cat in your house that's not your cat, that's likely a jinn. And you're supposed to ask the cat very politely but firmly, thank you for visiting, but please leave. And that's your way of ushering the jinn out of your house. But cats have this connection throughout not just Islamic cosmology, but also in Islamic history. We find that when various encyclopedic texts are written in the medieval era, for example, Al-Khazwini, there'll be references to cats or jinn-like cats, or cat-like jinns, even jinns that have cat heads and human bodies all show up in these texts. So they do have a sort of unique relationship with it. And even to this day, this is not just a historical, but it's a lived cultural experience. You'll find in very Middle Eastern cultures and Islamic cultures references to cats as jinn, both as being uniquely pure creatures that was loved by God and by Muhammad, but also as mischievous creatures that can be a little bit jinn-like.
I hate to ask this question, but it has to be brought up. Did any of the cat creatures ever procreate with a human in the same way that in Homer's Iliad?
Right.
There are mention of and in several myths, there's always mention of the gods and taking on animal form and procreating with a human. Was there any stories like that?
There are stories of crossbreeding between jinn and humans. There is one particular jinn that has some cat-like qualities, but it's not exclusively a cat. And it's known as the Seale. And the Seale do mate with humans. They generally draw humans out into the desert, is what it's described as, and then they seduce the human. This may speak to the anxieties of a nomadic merchant society in which you're traveling in caravans through the desert and through these various places. And so the fear of the stranger, the Seale may be an embodiment of that or an experience of that. And so the Seale do mate with humans, and then a half human, half Jinn monster-like creature is born known as a Nasnas. And a Nasnas is kind of a half human. It has one leg, one arm, one eye, and its head is in its chest. So it's a sort of malformed, homunculus-like creature. But the reason the Seale are considered slightly cat-like is because they're believed to be hunted by wolves. And so wolves have a unique taste for the Nasnas and for the Seale because they have some sort of cat-like quality, and so they're drawn to them. They generally hide in bushes away from the wolves, but when wolves go away, they then come out and take on beautiful forms and seduce humans. So they don't quite take on animal forms when they're sleeping with humans, which is different in the Greek mythology. For example, you certainly find Zeus taking on the figure of a bull and whatnot with Europa and whatnot. But you do have them as being shapeshifters, some of them being animals and then taking human form, or some of them having human form and then taking animal form. So they shift. They're not quite as fixed in their bodily representations. They move about because of their capacity as shapeshifters. But definitely some crossbreeding between Jinn and humans is happening in the lore.
I would love to just get started on some sort of mythology book. I've never delved into any such thing, and it's like a rabbit hole I'm going to fall into.
Right.
Book you can recommend that would get me started? Two books. One, just like a simple book of a good one on starting with the mythologies, and then another that maybe looks into some sort of just a study on it, maybe.
Yeah. There are not a lot of good popular books, if I'm honest. There's not quite a bit. It's still a very emerging field in that regards. And the reality is that folklore studies and mythologic studies have been pretty heavily Western centric. So what books that we have, I mean, even I grew up with Deleuze's Greek myths, right? It's like all of our experiences with myths have always been either Greek and Roman. And then if you're really spicy, you throw in the Nordic and maybe the Egyptian, right? That's the sort of addition. That's the flavor that you got. If you Japanese mythology, Indian mythology, and Hindu mythology, Islamic mythology, almost rarely ever seen. And then when it does show up, it generally shows up in a work of global mythology and generally in very small bits. But we are starting to see things change. I think there's generally an interest, a global interest in folklore, cosmologies, and mythologies. And so hopefully we will see more around the Jinn. There is a good book that does a comparative approach. It is an academic book, but very accessible. It's El-Zein's Islam, Arabs, and the Intelligent World of the Jinn. I think it's Arabs, Islam, and the Intelligent World of the Jinn, but something along those lines. It's a phenomenal book. She comes at it from the perspective of comparative literature. And so she's very interested in making the connections to Greek societies, to Mesopotamian mythologies, to the ancient Near East more broadly. It's a very accessible text and does a phenomenal job of introducing the Jinn to non-specialists. But I think that book has kind of opened the door, and we will see more going forward on the Jinn. I'm working on stuff on the Jinn. I know other people are as well. So in the next 5 years or so, we're going to see a nice little interesting explosion of work on the Jinn itself. But El-Zein's book is phenomenal. I highly recommend it.
I will be asking you again, to type up the name and everything, and I'll take
Sure. Yeah, more than happy to.
Last question. What do you think of the Arabian Nights? Like, does that reflect any of this well, or not at all? Or, how do you feel about it? Is that a good entry way at all whatsoever for children or me?
Yeah, I think it is. There's been some pushback on the Arabian Nights from scholarship because it is replete with Orientalist tropes. There are a lot of the sort of translations is interjected various Orientalist interpolations. But the Arabian Nights does have precedent in the medieval and perhaps even older tradition. There's a sort of Persianate tradition of the Arabian Nights that exists. The idea of a person telling stories over 40 days or 40 nights or whatnot. And these stories are an anthology that includes various themes that overlap, adventures, caliphs, magic, jinn, etc. I think that Arabian Nights still is a pretty good entryway into it, as long as you're aware that some of the translations kind of have Orientalist lenses and there's some kind of iffy stuff in there. But I think it's just pretty useful. I'm not one of the people who wants to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think there's something useful there, and it's worthwhile to look at it from a literary perspective. There's been a recent translation of it, if I'm not mistaken, by Yasmine Seale. I might be mispronouncing her name, so I do apologize. But she did a brilliant translation, a recent translation that did just got rave reviews from the New Yorker. And I'm happy to share the link for that. So I would recommend that. And there's some really phenomenal translators out there that are not just working on the Arabian Nights, but are working on other epics that exist, the Siras, and really bringing them to life, because there is a whole beautiful tradition of epic storytelling that is on par with the Homeric tradition. These great epic tales of heroes and gods and jinns and monsters that really unveil a complex literary tradition, a beautiful and nuanced cosmology. And so I think we're living in a sort of golden age of that, where we're going to see more and more of those translations come out.
I sure hope so. I'm so looking
Yeah,
forward.
fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed, indeed. Comparative mythology. Oh, I'm all about that. I
Yeah.
wanted to be really sort of well grounded in my Greek
Mhm.
mythologies before I started doing comparative studies with Filipino mythologies. People always wonder,
Mhm.
like, why don't you do Filipino mythology? Well, because I grew up with so many folk
Mhm.
that I would like to compare it to
Yeah.
other culture that we were colonized with.
Right. Yeah. No, I think there's a lot of really productive work that can be done through comparative mythologies and comparative folklores and comparative history, as long as one remains, faithful to the specific historic conditions themselves, without being like everything is the same. This god equals that. I think that can really erase some of the nuances. But I think I'm a comparative. Despite myself, I'm a big believer in it. So I'm very sympathetic to your project of finding those links that bind us all together, because histories might be different, trajectories might be different, but the commonality of human experience, right? We all experience grief, we all experience woe, we experience joy, and that's found in our mythologies.
Well, on that note, thank you so much. I know we ran 10 minutes over the time that you.
It's a pleasure talking to you.
Oh, thank you. And this was just our first connection, so if you don't mind, at some point uh,
Happy to, yeah.
thank you. I would, because I'd love to process what we talked about and then
Sure.
find a passage and go, okay, this I
Right.
reminds me of this. So this was just intro to Ali Olomi's work with comparative.
Well, it was a pleasure being here and chatting with you, and I'm a big fan of what you're doing.
Oh, thank you so much. Okay, well, you have a wonderful day, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you very much. Bye bye.